This presentation is brought to you by California State Parks Off-Highway Motor Vehicle Recreation Division. It is intended for educational purposes only, and the content is subject to change. Applicants and grantees must consult the regulations related to their project year. Please contact your grant administrator if you have any questions. Contact information can be found at ohv.parks.ca.gov by clicking Grants at the top of the page and then Grants Contacts. You can also email the grants team at ohv.grants@parks.ca.gov. In this session, we focus on the documents and forms required for payment requests, specifically for reimbursements within our Grants and Cooperative Agreements program. We review examples of digital file organization, supporting documentation, and fill out all tabs of an expenditure workbook. We'll also review what's required within a final payment request. This session is just under 2.5 hours and is facilitated by 2 of our grant administrators. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so we're going to go over where to start in your in this payment request process. We're going to look at organization and document labeling. Jess is really going to talk quite a bit about that. She is an organization queen. I've been saying it. I know her closet much more organized than mine. We're going to be showing you where to get the forms and the workbooks online. We're going to take you through examples of supporting documents. We're going to review the workbook, each tab that it has. Some of you veterans out there, that might be a little bit boring to you, but we have a lot of new people that joined our program recently. We're also going to look at how to do a subsequent payment request. We're going to take a peek at the project accomplishment reports. But we'll also be having another session on that coming up in detail June 2nd. That will be recorded. We're going to talk about emailing your submission. We're also going to look at common payment request issues and some unique situations that come up. And then we're also going to look at what's required in a final payment request. Next slide, please.
Okay, let's start with where to start. So really the first thing we would recommend thinking about is your timeline. You know, what is the best time to submit for your agency? Is it quarterly? Is it twice a year? Is it a one and done type situation where you're only doing one payment request at the end? Really, that's up to the agency. You have up to 120 days after the end of your project performance period to turn in your final payment request and all supporting documentation. So from our perspective, that's the only regulatory requirement. Beyond that, some agencies need to process quarterly, like the forests and the BLMs. They tend to get their activity reports quarterly. So we see a lot of them submitting payment requests quarterly, which is a really good strategy because that way, if something comes up during those payment request reviews, we can address it right then. Sometimes if you have a one and done payment request and it's past the performance period, and let's say we have to disallow match or an invoice or something like that, it can throw off your numbers, and that's when you have some surprises that we can't correct because the performance period is over. So those are some things that you need to think about. We also hear sometimes from our law enforcement agencies that their governing body wants them to process their payment requests quarterly. So just a good place to start thinking about what's going to work out for your agency. And then keeping in mind the division timelines. So right now, we just had all of our preliminary applications come through. The team is starting to prepare for our reviews, and we're likely going to go to 1 day a week for our administrative tasks, and the other days we'll be reading. So we're going to be processing closeouts and payment requests a bit slower. We also see a spike in submissions, which is starting to happen right now because all the projects that ended in December, they have until April 30th to submit their payment request, and now they're starting to come in because we're getting closer to April 30th. So this time of year is kind of a perfect storm of all of those things happening at the same time. So if it's important to you or your governing body to have payments processed quickly, good to do it, starting at that first quarter and so on. So just some things to think about. Also, you're going to start rounding up your documentation as you prepare to compose your payment request. You're going to, find your equipment use logs. Maybe it's folks out in the field that have them. Pull together your volunteer logs, your receipts from, it might be that you're managing a couple districts and you need to get all the invoicing in. Definitely a good idea to do so throughout the year so that you can have all the information starting to come in. You can add activities to your project accomplishment report. You can start composing your equipment use and volunteer summaries. And just thinking about, do you have a place to put this information? Can you set up a Dropbox or a SharePoint for the team where everybody has access to it and can, drop in those fuel receipts or what have you? Next slide, please. So moving on with organization, other things to keep in mind is, where are you going to save this folder? Now that we're in this digital world and everything is on our computers, you have to think about, do you want the rest of your team to have access to it? What if you leave your position and the project gets audited? Will somebody have access to get to all of that information? Should you print a backup copy just in case something happens with your drive? We've seen folks lose information, pretty common thing that happens. So, other things that are important, you also want to think about how you're going to scan these submissions, right? So for larger submissions, we're seeing a lot of folks scanning by category. So they take all their materials and supplies, they label them by attachment number, they scan them all together, and then they save them in individual folders. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. For the smaller submissions, maybe it's best that you would organize it by category and scan everything together. Maybe it's only a $1,200 payment request and you don't really need to separate things too much. You can just have it all scanned together. Let's see a couple examples of what that looks like. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the left, we have a fabulous example from Mendocino National Forest where their strategy, because they have a large grant, a large award amount, is to create a folder for each category. So you see staff, contracts, materials and supplies, and so on. They're indicating if it's grant or match in that folder. And then right below it is an example of what's inside. So in that materials and supplies folder, they have their materials and supplies invoice M.1 through M.3 scanned together. And then that MS1 is actually their activity report, their combined spending and payroll detail. They filter it, so it's just those items. So that's an example of organizing a larger submission. Having only 3 materials and supplies receipts is pretty unique. Sometimes we see, 80 I've seen, I think is the most, all at the same time. So that definitely shows a good time to organize your information with that many invoices. But even for just these 3, that was really helpful that they submitted it that way. Now on the right-hand side, you see an example of labeling where all of the supporting documentation is in the same folder. It has the workbook at the top. If you add a number like a 0, it's going to rank it at the very top. Then they have their combined spending and payroll detail ranked at the top to support the workbook totals. And then below that, you see the staff category, contracts, materials and supplies, and so on. So they're rank ordering all of the documentation using a numbering system. And then they're telling information within those documents, like what category it is. Is it grant or staff? What's the attachment number? Maybe a little tip on the end of what it is. It's an activity report or it's receipts. And really, not only is that helpful for me as the grant administrator as I'm processing that payment request, but helpful for your team too. Again, in that scenario where maybe you've moved on from your position, or maybe you're just not in charge of the payment request anymore. Fast forward 2 years, an audit comes through and an auditor says, hey, I want to see attachment number, whatever, and it would be really easy to pull that information. Now, none of the labeling or organization is required. You know, obviously we're not going to make that a regulatory requirement. We're just trying to show you some examples to help and share, you know, what works good for us, and you also decide on what works best for you. Next slide, please. Now to deep dive, back up one, please, Matt. Thank you so much. To deep dive into the labeling a little bit further, just to kind of see it as at a glance, and a lot of you probably saw this in your grant administrator meetings as well. The grant administrators met together and we said, hey, you know, what's an easy way for us to understand what we're looking at, and something easy for the grantees to do as well. So this is what we came up with. There's some variations too. Some grant administrators have other recommendations, but this is, again, just an example for you. So at the top, you see a payment request form label, and we recommend having the project agreement number in there because you're going to have multiple projects potentially over the years. You want to know what you're looking at. We have an underscore with the title of that form. Our payment request form is called the DPR 364. And then we have an underscore leading into payment request 1 to designate that as payment request 1. Now, one thing you'll notice about these labels is there's no spacing. And part of that strategy is something that we learned from our IT team, that if a document is deleted on accident from your server, it's easier for you to retrieve it if that title is short, has very little characters, and no spaces. So that we also considered when thinking about how to come up with a naming convention, as we call it. For the workbook, same strategy. You've got your project number, workbook, designation, payment request 1, and then you'll notice the common theme with the supporting document examples. You have your rank order of how it's listed on the workbook, 1 through 6, the staff as the category total, what type of funds, and the attachment number. Other documents that you'll be submitting to us would be the project accomplishment report. There's an example there of labeling, and then soils and HMP. So soils compliance report, just a quick little SCR for HMP, habitat management plan, just a quick little HMP works for us. Does anyone have any questions on these organization tips? Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Next slide, please. You're on mute, Maria.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for flipping the slide there. So where do you get these documents? That would be from our website, and a lot of you are already familiar with our website, ohv.parks.ca.gov. Up at the top, you would see the link for grants. You want to be in that OHV category first, so that you know you're getting the motorized grants. And then on the right-hand side, you find the link for grant forms. So you would click on that, and that takes you to this page, and we'll just look at it live right now. Let me see. There we go. Ideally, you all can see my screen now.
I do.
Oh, great. So here's our website where you can download all of the forms that you need for reporting to our program. So each linked form has its description right above it. See, here we are. This is the Expenditure Workbook for Reimbursement. And up the top, it has its description, reimbursement, submit the following workbook, which contains the DPR 364. That's the form you sign and PDF for payment, along with a project accomplishment report and so forth. So that's the one that we'll be discussing. The advanced justification request and the advanced expenditure workbook, that will be discussed in more detail in November. So the project accomplishment reports are down below, and here you have one for each project type: ground operations, development, planning, acquisition, restoration, law enforcement, education, and safety. Without a project accomplishment report accompanying your workbook, you can't get paid. It's required that two have to go together. The workbook lists all of your purchases, all of your costs. The project accomplishment report is the narrative of what your purchases did, how they supported your project deliverables. So it's those two have to come together. Do go to our website and download it if you haven't done that already. To the right, I'm going to show you quickly where our regulations are. They're right there. I'm going to click on it. Let me see, it opens right up. You want the grant cycle for the project that you're reporting for, that grant year. So we'll say that you're reporting for a G22 project. I click on that. I click on the regs. They come open right away. This opened up to my last search that I did, but let me see. I'll take you to our table of contents quickly. Go. And I just wanted to show you how it is pretty easy to navigate. It's not too bad. You just look for what you're looking for in the table of contents, for instance. And I'll say I'm going to eligible equipment, heavy equipment costs for all grantees, excluding nonprofits, so governmental agencies. I'm going to click on that. And it jumps me right to that category. Another shortcut for looking for items is just do a word search. I'll say public comment. Not police comment, public comment. And there it jumped me right to that piece of the regulation in the grant cycle of when the public comments are due, or that public comment period. There's explanation for it. So that's our quick tour. Matt, go ahead and take it back. There we go. Thanks for doing that. So here we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at each cost category and the types of documents that are required for each cost category. We're going to look at just a couple different scenarios and why things are the way they are and what's acceptable and what isn't. Here, I'm just getting a little bit situated here. So here there are a lot of you forest staff here with us today. We're glad to see all of you here. We have, for the staff cost category for the grant report, we have an example of a combined spending and payroll details report from the United States Forest Service. We blocked out all the names because they might be camera shy. They don't want to be on camera at all. So what's required is a report showing the name of an employee, the title, position, dates worked, hours, rate, and the total. We need the total in order to pay you. For Bureau of Land Management and United States Forest Service, we do accept, for forests, the combined spending and payroll details. For BLM, we also accept your FBMS labor reports. Those are good and they're easily auditable. So what we are looking at right here is a forest agency that was able to sort their combined spending and payroll details for just staff only. So not all of you have the ability to do this, but if you do have the ability to sort your costs, we do encourage it. It might help save you some time, actually. It would save the grant administrator time, but no worries if you can't. I'll show you what to do if you can't do this. What we have on the screen here is the lower portion of a forest, of that forest spending report that just shows the staff detail. It has the total, the $73,443, and it also shows what was charged to indirect. The grand total is $69,132. So that's what we would expect to see in the cost category for staff grant. And we would see that 4310 in the indirect cost category. So this right here, this really works. It would have an attachment number. I am going to borrow the screen again. And I'm going to show you what we normally see from Forest Service. Right here, here's another example of a combined spending and payroll details from the Forest Service. And what this grantee does, and I do encourage other Forest Service offices to highlight when you can't sort and separate out your costs and they're all mixed in together, like materials and supplies, contract costs, and so forth. They are also mixed in with payroll. Highlight and categorize your costs. Right here, everything in green is materials and supplies. Everything in blue is their equipment use costs. This line right here, let me see. Let me zoom in. Forgot to do that there. This line right here for rock art, materials and supplies, it also had a little bit of indirect cost in it. So I just wrote that note in there that of that 1348.50, a portion of it, this portion of it went to indirect, and that portion, the 232.50, went to indirect. So notes like that written directly into your reports are really helpful. Everything that's not highlighted is a staffing cost. And again, we blocked out the names to protect those that are camera shy. Here's some more green for materials and supplies. One was incorrectly labeled. We checked each one of these against your workbook. One was incorrectly color coded. That one was indirect. Here's light yellow. That was an indirect cost. And so forth. Getting down to the end. So here we are at the end. You'll see the orange was the contracting cost. There we go. So here I see the total for materials and supplies. That agreed with the workbook. Contracts, that agreed with the workbook. I checked every one of these off. Equipment use, that agreed with the workbook. Indirect, and everything that was not highlighted, what was left over was the staffing cost. There it is. And that was a total, which agrees with the total with their combined mixed spending report. The grantee only had this item color coded. I added this right here on the right hand side just to make sure that everything agreed with the workbook correctly. But this is just an additional step that you could do for us also to show how you totaled all the categories and that they agree with the workbook. Let me see, we'll look at a couple other examples. Staff county. This is a county report that was charged to the grant. It was a director for the facilities and airport here. And they are showing the time period worked, the hours, the rate, and the total charged to the grant. Here would be the total that we would see in the workbook. Here's a report from law enforcement. Okay. And it shows the quantity of hours, the rate, and the totals right there. They highlighted the totals for us. These are the totals that we'll see in the workbook, and this is the attachment that will be numbered. Let me increase the size for y'all. I go to page 2. Right here, again, they highlighted the total hours charged, the total amount charged, which is really helpful. And they also included a best practice, which is to separate their overtime hours from the regular pay rate. So that's also helpful. Matt, go ahead and take the screen. And next slide, please. Okay, so what we have here is another example of it's staff match. So this is actually paid cash match. The staff were being paid, but they were contributing project activities towards the grant. There you have the date on the left-hand side. The pay period would be populated. The first and last name would be populated. Their title, what they did going towards the grant. They're including a job code, the hours worked base rate, and the total applied to match. And down below, they separated their direct costs from the indirect costs. And these, again, the totals would agree with what's reported in the workbook. Next slide, please.
And Maria,
Yes.
What would they need for an audit? So this is all stuff we need for the payment request. What should they have also as backup that they don't submit to us for an audit?
Their time card. We don't need that submitted to us, but an auditor would look for your time card. Yes. So
Thank
always
you.
keep that in mind. They'll look for signatures and the job codes and that sort of thing on your originating time cards. Next slide, please. Okay, more about supporting documents. Here we have volunteer, an example of volunteer summary report. Your volunteers, you want to list them under the staff cost category on the match tab of the workbook, and the screen went away. There we are. Submit, you want to submit that volunteer summary report. It has to include the name of the volunteer, the dates and hours worked, the hourly rate, the location, and activities related to the project. So it has to be an activity that supports the project in some way. We will check everything against your project agreements. And this, what you have on your screen is an example of different volunteers doing slightly different activities on different days. If they were doing the same activity on the same day, such as a volunteer day, the information for the activity and the location could be captured as an overall heading at the top of the form, for instance, instead of repeating the same function all the way down your summary sheet. So we have different examples of the way you could summarize your volunteer match and your staff match. If you need any examples of these templates, just let us know and we'd be glad to send them out. Next slide, please.
Okay, and before we move forward to more supporting documents, we just wanted to take a pause. We just reviewed all the staff and volunteer requirements. We just wanted to see if anybody wanted to speak up and unmute themselves with the question, or if you wanted to add something in the chat, and we can field it that way. Just wanted to take a pause.
Yeah, this is a good place for a pause.
And please do ask. There's no such thing as a bad question. Trust me, there's times I get questions and I'm like, gosh, I never thought about that. And we really do appreciate it. Okay, it sounds like you guys don't have questions, but we will for sure check throughout the session. If something comes up, feel free to pocket it. We can answer it later. And at the very end, we'll also ask if anyone has questions. So you should have plenty of time throughout this session to ask questions, and feel free to raise your hand regardless if we asked if anyone had questions, and we can have Debbie give us a heads up that you have a question, and we'll take a moment. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Supporting documentation. So before we move into materials and supplies and talking about contract invoicing and whatnot, this is just a general tips for that documentation. Obviously, it needs to be legible, must have a date on it so that we can make sure that the charge occurred within the project performance period, which we'll check on every document. Feel free to highlight that date to call it out, because sometimes it takes a minute to find it. And then for nonprofits, you must show a zero balance or have a paid stamp with a date on it. If not, if you don't have that paid stamp or the zero balance, you're going to be submitting a canceled check for proof of payment, transaction register, or a screenshot of a financial system showing that there was payment. So again, really, I think one of the most important things, and it's surprising when I get receipts that are hard to look at, and I think maybe that's because people scan it and don't check on it again once they've scanned it. So I think a good best practice would be, scan all your documentation, scroll through it, see if you can see the date and the total and what the item was that you purchased on there, because that's what I'm going to look for. An auditor, compliance, or my supervisor. These are all folks that are going to look at this documentation to make sure that we know what you're asking to get reimbursed for. Next slide, please.
Thanks. So the next cost category is contracts. So for each of your contracts, we need you to submit one copy of each contract. Keep in mind that one-time services are really not considered contracts. I know sometimes you have contractors that you call and they come out and they'll give you a hand with one of your project deliverables. They're contractors, but if there is no contract associated with that, you can list them in the other cost category. If you don't have anything budgeted in the cost category, that's okay too, because they're if they're providing a support activity for one of your project deliverables, just send us an email and let us know. Not a big deal. So we want one copy of each contract. For Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, sometimes your contracts, they can be pretty hard to read. And sometimes our grant program is one, we'll say like 2 lines within an overall larger contract. Highlight the portion of the contract that belongs to this grant project so that it stands out. That would be really helpful. And if something is not clear, please feel free to write an explicative note on it. It could be really hard to find the project information within one, what is essentially, it's like a really big overall contract for your entire project there. I'll say your entire field office. And our grant program is only, say, for instance, like 25% of that. So those kind of notes and the highlights are helpful. So the contract invoices, we will pay you based on the contract invoices. Please don't include a total obligation cost, for instance, or total encumbrance cost, unless it is invoiced. We only want you to include the costs that are actually invoiced and that are processed for payment. That's really important. And also the performance period should really be listed on that invoice. Right here, we circled it on this example shown. And the activity is probably not very clear, the description right here. But this invoice also contained a description of what the contractor was doing. So that said, are there any questions so far for the contracts cost category?
Looks like we actually did get one from Paulette. Mendocino National Forest is here. And she said, if you end up getting match in a category that doesn't show up on grant, does it need to be pre-approved prior to submitting it as match, or can it go under indirect match, or is all match welcomed?
I will say, just send us an email so we could talk about it and we could look at it. I mean, if it happened, if you didn't know it was going to happen, but it did happen, all of a sudden you had somebody out there that was helping you on your project that you didn't necessarily anticipate, I mean, we would still consider it as long as it's within the performance period and it makes sense, you know? So you can have new lines of match pop up during your performance period. That's okay. Ideally, you'll be emailing us before it actually happens so we could talk about it first and make sure it's applicable. If you don't get prior approval first, I mean, that doesn't mean that we're not going to accept it. We just want to look at it and discuss it with you. And then we'll email you, yes, it's good to go, or no, or what have you. And then you keep our email in the project file as your match being approved. Let me see. Are there any other questions here?
I think we're good to move forward.
Paulette is laughing. She's saying they usually inform me after the fact. Gotta retrain those guys, man. I understand.
Well, and just to add to that a little bit, you know, a project cost estimate is truly an estimate. We recognize that, right? You guys, many of you probably just submitted your preliminary application. You did your best guess of how much things are going to cost, how much match you're going to receive, and that type of thing. And you know, if you notice the team went out and they worked extra long hours and there ended up being more match on the staff time, you know, that makes sense depending on what you accomplished, and you can tell that story in the project accomplishment report, you know. But like Maria said, it's all about email communication. You know, if you see a big spike in match, probably a good thing to put a note in file, and we do that by email. If a source of match falls through and you need to change gears, definitely reach out to us ahead of time, because We want to make sure whatever your backup plan is something that would be allowed, and that would avoid any surprises at the end. We don't want to have surprise match come through and we say, ooh, that's not really related to the project, we can't accept that, which I've seen. Then we have to disallow it, and then you're short on match and either owing a refund or we're not going to pay out your full reimbursement amount. So I think communication is key, and you have a lot of passionate grant administrators that love what we do. We love to hear your successes, but also we like to help you work through any challenges you have. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're moving on to, you're welcome, Paulette. Thanks for joining. We're going to talk about materials and supplies. So I would say this is probably one of the more technical supporting documentation that we look at. With the staff reports, that's easy. We have a report, we check the dates. Does it make sense? Does it compare against what we had on the project agreement, the total? And that's a pretty easy exercise. Similar thing with contracts. But with materials and supplies, that's where we tend to get a big giant batch of invoices and receipts, and that's where the grant administrators, we'll pull up each receipt. Maybe they're all scanned together, which is great, and you scroll through each, and you're looking at the date to make sure it's within the performance period. That's the first place I go to. If you want to highlight it, super appreciated. In this example, you see a little arrow in the top right kind of designating it. We see a ton of invoices from Rock Art. A lot of our signs and materials for signs and kiosks come from them. So we're comfortable with Rock Art. We're familiar with them and see them all the time. And then I'd start to look down at what am I looking at? Where does the materials and supplies in this invoice, what line item do they fall under? Now, at the top right, we've got an attachment number listed. We've got a little description, Rock Art signage for materials and supplies. If you want to add notes, whether it's handwritten or you PDF it and you type in notes, that is really appreciated. One thing that Mendocino does, for example, is they will actually write what line item it is from their project agreement. They've had grants close to $1 million. Trust me, that's extremely helpful when you're looking at all of these things, because sometimes it's just bolts or, just little ins and outs. When you're looking at a ground ops or, anything where you're getting materials and supplies to do actual work, sometimes you guys know more than we do about what it is. We definitely try to stay on top of what things are. I know a lot of us, if we see an invoice and we have no idea what it is, we'll go to that company and search for that ID. But if you give us a little heads up, that just gives us a little bit more direction as to where you're claiming it and if we're able to allow it. Because we have to go by each material and supply invoice and say, can I allow it? Can I allow it? Is this indirect? An example on the screen there, this is one that Maria processed. See highlighted in yellow the US flag decals, which we sometimes see on these invoices. It is something that's allowed. If you're using that to make it where folks are not shooting at signs, we've heard that from everybody. Definitely a good thing to even write in as your note on a line item when you're applying, if you're going to ask for these. But they do fall under indirect, so that's not something we can pay for as direct. So she highlighted it in yellow, calling it out as indirect. And on the workbook, if there was the total for that invoice, she would then back it out and as a negative and say, moved US flag decals over to indirect. And then, of course, if we make any adjustments on the workbook, we're going to send that copy back to you so that we have the same copy on file. But this is something that you should do as a proactive pass too before you submit it to us, is just kind of going through all your documentation before you submit it and say, is there anything in here that's indirect that I should move? It just saves us a little time, but we'll try to have your back too as we're going through it. We'd rather catch this now than if an auditor or somebody else in the future caught it, because then we've usually already paid you at that point and it would result in a refund. So we're always trying to avoid that. So it's always good to have a partnership where we're both looking for those type of things. I'm going to take over the screen and show an activity report. Now, we've been using a lot of forest examples, which really, I know we'll speak to the BLMs too, because they also have their FBMS report. It looks very similar. You know, the forests, they're all using the same thing. But any of you locals or even nonprofits, if you guys have some type of ledger, just think of it like this. You know, we're just literally talking about a ledger that houses all of your charges. Maybe you're lucky enough to be able to assign a job code that makes it easier for you to pull this type of reporting. But that's why we keep going back to this, because it's something we absolutely see often. Now, earlier, Maria was talking about how helpful it is for you to filter your information when you submit it to us. And so if you're talking about a report like the combined spending and payroll detail, in this example, Mendocino, again, we're using a lot of their examples. Thanks for letting us use them, Paulette. They filtered this information by just the materials and supplies within this payment request. And it was just their first. So really not too much going on in that first payment request for materials and supplies. But what they did is they added on that report a column, and they added a note section. And on that note section, they labeled attachment number 1, and they told us what it is, and so on. So this is a situation where instead of listing all the materials and supplies as separate line items on that workbook, because they handed us a really good coding system and we can check against the charge and the attachment number, they were able to, and they do this for all their line items really because they have such a good coding system, they just put that $907.07 total on the workbook under materials and supplies. So I saw that as the one line item total. I opened this activity report. It was the first document, and below it were also scans of those materials and supplies attachments 1 through 3. Then I held them up side by side and I compared the total on that invoice to what was on that activity report. I highlighted it as I check it off and all was well, and I moved on. So this is an example of splitting it apart and labeling it. You can send it as a PDF if you want to, but save yourself time. If you want to just send it as an Excel, that's totally fine too. It doesn't have to be a PDF. Nothing has to be a PDF that's an Excel nowadays. You can absolutely send your Excels. I know in the past you used to have to mail everything, and so a lot of folks are used to PDFing their workbooks and stuff like that, but you don't have to. And we would actually prefer that you don't, because we can check the formulas and make sure that all is well within those Excels. Okay, Matt, you can take it back from here. Thank you.
Hey, Jessica and Maria, I had an email question that came in, and since you guys have been talking a lot about ledgers, the question asks, what happens if I just send my timesheets? Those have all of the information you are asking for. Do I really have to send a ledger on top of that?
Yes, we need a ledger, because if you imagine how many grantees we have and all the different types of time cards they have, it's not as easy as one would think to discern what information is on that time card. And so at the very least, you would want to put it in Excel, but if you can pull a report, that would be ideal. Save those time cards for the audits. If you send in info we don't need, we have to review it. So that just extends our review time. So do, hold back things like your time cards just to save the review time.
Also on your payroll, your what's been paid out, if it includes staff costs on there that are not part of the grants program, just highlight what is applicable to the grants program. Make sure what is applicable to the grants program stand out. On the other flip side, you can also cross out what doesn't apply to the grants program.
Any other questions?
Okay. So thank you. With that, we're going to go ahead and go on to the next slide, which is supporting documents for equipment use. So here we have an example of a use fee. And use fees are allowable for equipment purchased with funds outside of the grants program. You cannot charge a use fee to anything that you did buy with grant funds. And either government agencies or nonprofits can assess a use fee to the equipment being used in the grants program, but it could only be for actual time. let me see. In order to get paid, to be reimbursed, you would prepare a summary. You can prepare a summary like this if you can't run, for instance, like a fleet report and make it specific to the grants program. You can prepare a report like this in Excel. It has to contain the activity date, the work performed, the use fee being charged, the unit of measurement, and normally it's by days, but we have seen hours, and some sort of a vehicle identifier also. So here on this report, to the right-hand side, it contains some detail about what project activity they did and also about the location. Just another note for nonprofits, you can only do a maximum of $150 per piece of equipment per day unless it's heavy equipment, and that's a little bit different. Let me see. So I'm going to show you a little example also about how you get to that information for some of the government agencies that we have attending here, because this Bureau of Land Management and United States Forest Service, sometimes they have, you know, their pink cards. This is really raw. We actually don't want to see that in the office. Please don't send it to us. But I just wanted to show you that it does have some of the required information on there. It has the equipment number. It has the odometer. It has the date, July, days used, and it has a signature. So that signature, an auditor will want to see it for sure. So you want to make sure you get copies of these pink cards when you're assessing costs to the grant programs. And this grantee, what they did is to discern the grant, they wrote a G right next to the day they used it for the grant. And in addition to that, the operator also did a separate sheet where the operator listed their activities for that date that were project related for that vehicle type. And then lastly, the grant admin staff took the activities and then prepared a summary, such as the one I showed earlier. Matt, go ahead and take the screen. Thank you. So the grant admin staff out in the field, they prepared a summary like this using all of the information. So there is an extra step that you have to do in recording the activities and perhaps some more, being more specific with the location also when you're assessing vehicle use fees to the grants program. With that said, we'll go ahead and we'll go to the next slide, please. That, what we're leaving just now, that is like a gold standard. Let me see, it looks like we got a question on chat. Let me see, can we use weekly odometer for equipment use if that week was all for that particular grant? So just to clarify, government agencies to our program cannot charge by mile. They can charge a use fee. So it depends, this question would depend a little bit more. If you are a nonprofit, you can bill by miles.
And Michelle is, Michelle is, she works with both. She works with Plymouth County, but also Sierra Buttes Trail Stewardship. So that's a good question.
So yes, you can use weekly odometer here. That actually falls in line with the next slide that we have up on the screen right here. Per mile fee, nonprofits only. And for that summary, you want to include the activity date, work performed, total miles, the per mile fee being assessed to the grants program. Here we have the rate for 2023, and the vehicle type. Or some other form of vehicle identifier. You need to discern also if it was transportation or operation. including the activity that you performed for the day, what you were transporting, tools and supplies, or maybe it was just yourself and a volunteer, or if you were operating, what were you doing for the project for that day? Signing, perhaps, or repairing a fence. Those are just two examples. For transportation, you are limited to 100 miles per day in each direction, so that's 200 miles total. For operation, you're limited to 150 miles of operating activities for the day at the project site only. Anything above 150 miles, that would be a tall order to exceed that. You can charge to match. Let me see.
And again, this is just for nonprofits, right? So we're talking per mile fee. It might change in the future, but one thing to add, Michelle, about your question is we don't need to see the odometer readings. In the past, we used to have that turned in, but that's something that you would want to keep on file for an audit, because you have to, if you get audited and they look at a summary like what Maria is highlighting right now, they're going to say, how did you come to those miles? And so at that point, you're going to say, do we keep those odometer readings? I mean, that's a great way to show,
Yeah, you do want to keep the odometer readings. Michelle, if you would like to see an example of a vehicle log that you would keep inside your vehicle to fill out, and it would have a beginning, ending odometer readings, and also a place where you could record your activities for the day, let us know. We can send something out to you. Let me see. Another quick mention, if all you're doing is transporting, you can create a report that has an overarching activity if it's the same recurring activity each time. You can list that up top instead of splitting it over here to the right. Another thing that we were talking about right before this meeting, and good. Michelle says, got it, we have logs. Just want to yeah, we don't need to see the originating logs, but I'm grateful that you do have them, because we don't want to see you get an audit disallowance. It's happened to some of my grantees. I felt really bad. So glad you got that.
Jess,
yeah.
As a nonprofit, can they invoice for actual vehicle costs?
I was trying to think of what Robert means by that. Can you picture what type of document that would look like, Maria?
As a nonprofit, can we invoice for your actual vehicle costs? So you can bill by mile, or you can bill, you can assess the cost with a fee rate if the vehicle was purchased outside of the grants program. Those are the two ways that you would recover costs for your vehicle maintenance, for instance. Let me see.
And then the regs, you've got, and I just did a quick keyword search for UC, but you could also search by nonprofit to jump through all the nonprofit topics. But in the equipment, eligible equipment cost section, you can charge a UC in accordance with the grantee's local fair market rental rates, or a per mile fee. So it really, when you say actual vehicle costs, it does have to fit into those two categories. So if we're talking about actual costs of the use fee, then that's great. A per mile fee would capture anything that would be like your fuel and maintenance. And for nonprofits, we just have you all report it as that per mile fee, but that kind of on the back end, we know that's where those costs go towards.
Robert, if you have more questions, I encourage you also to email your grant administrator. Yeah, let us know if you have a specific question on your mind. We'd be glad to give you a hand for sure. Let me see. The other, before we leave this slide, and the thoughts slipping my mind already, another thing that you could do for your summaries right here is you could add a column that is just for that indicates transportation with a T or operating with an O, for instance. They are two different categories. You have to track them separately. So that way you could sort this by the T and the O, and you could add up your costs and your miles separately for transportation and operation. Again, that would be adding another column right here and indicating if it was transportation with a T or operation with an O. Let me see, are there any other questions?
I think we'll just cover fuel costs and then take a break. We can go to the next slide, Matt. Okay, so we're just going to review this one little last slide, and then we'll take a break. And this is an example of a fuel receipt. So folks that are eligible for a fuel receipt, that would be everybody except for the nonprofits. Except for one note at the bottom, you see nonprofits can charge fuel for heavy equipment and items such as power tools. So that is the one exception for the fuel for nonprofits. But for everybody else that's submitting fuel receipts for your equipment, what you're going to do is submit a receipt for that fuel, and you're going to write on the top of the receipt what the fuel was used for. An example would be for chainsaws, for a Ford 150, for excavator. On this example, Mendocino wrote the attachment number E.1, awesome, and they even put the cost funding code there, I believe. And then they put equipment use ATV number 27, which is probably linked to the project agreement line item number. And then they put fuel for ATV to assist in OHV trail maintenance. That's perfect. I highlighted that was gas. I highlighted the date and the total. If you all want to do that, that's great. It helps call that information out. If not, that's just something we do. So it makes it easy for a subsequent reviewer to check it out. So that's for fuel receipts. And again, nonprofits, you are allowed fuel for heavy equipment and power tools. So that's a quick search you can do in the regs too for fuel. Just do a little keyword search and that will pull up as well. Does anyone have questions before we take a break?
Before we take a break, I will just add one additional tidbit to Robert's question earlier. For vehicles purchased with grant fund dollars, you can also provide regular maintenance. You can do the regular maintenance and the per mile fee. So I hope that was, with the information provided, it helped answer your question.
Okay, so I think we're going to take, oh, go ahead, Deb.
Oh, I was just going to say the same thing you were. I was going to say, I think it'd be a great time to take about a 5-minute break. Why don't we have everybody come back about 5 minutes? Would be 10:41.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay. See you guys in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Thanks, Deb.
All right, everybody, we will be back in just a moment. Hope you had an opportunity to get a stretch in, maybe get a coffee, bathroom break. If you haven't stretched yet, you still have just a little bit of time just to stand up, stretch, stick those arms out, shake them all about, and get ready for the second half of our program here. All right, Jess and Maria, you guys ready to rock the second half here?
Hey there, yes.
Indeed.
Mhm. All right,
I-
and here we go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, Maria. I did add a bunch of screenshots and links to the regs in the chat there for everybody that had questions on equipment use. So hopefully that helped a little. But if anyone thinks of any other questions, I know that's a very technical section of the regs. We can, field more questions later.
Sorry, drinking down my tea. So thanks, Jess. We also have it's like in a summary, a PDF that's a snapshot of the equipment use, what you can and can't do, that we can also send you. Deb, if you don't mind making a note. It's been a handout in the past for G22 and G23 regs. So I think we should follow up and with everybody and send it out. Okay.
I like that.
Yeah, it shows transportation costs and maintenance costs, what's allowable and what's not for equipment purchased with grant funds and outside of the grants program for regular equipment and heavy equipment. So I think that would be helpful to send to grantees after our training day here. So we are going to pick back up with equipment purchases and what we need for equipment purchases. And this is all items that are over $5,000 motorized. What we need are the purchase agreement documents, final invoice, photo of the piece of equipment with the OHB funds at work sticker affixed, photo of the VIN number, hopefully you can get to it. Government agencies, we need the certificate of origin. Nonprofit agencies, we need the titles. Let me see, for the other cost category, so I already mentioned a few things about the other cost category earlier. This is like one-time services, so that's fine. You had a contractor come out and do work on your in your field office that was project related, but you only called them and they sent you an invoice. It's not a contract, it's a one-time service. Trailers go in this category. They're not motorized. Fuel for your power tools go in this category. Per diem costs as approved in your project agreement. Publications, perhaps you hired somebody to develop an editorial for you. Indirect, I personally like indirect because we don't require documentation for it. Just explain it, please. Explain it in your workbook, in the notes section, and also explain it in your project accomplishment report. And that's it. And they do have to indirectly support your project in some way. Let me see. With that said, let's go to the next slide. Please, and give me just a second to organize myself here. And we are going to start getting into this workbook here and how to fill it out. Okay. Okay. We know that not everybody's an Excel whiz, but it's not that difficult to use. Also, I'll show you just a few little things. If you have any questions after this workshop on the workbook, feel free to contact your grant administrator. You can contact me directly as well. I don't mind. I'm going to take the screen. Okay. So here we are. For my demonstration today, I have just a really brief project agreement that Cleveland Forest North are letting us use with permission because it is short, so it's good for a short demo. So thanks, Jake Rodriguez, I appreciate it. Here's the workbook on the left-hand side. And you will see down below, it has several tabs that you will be using the first 4 tabs. Don't worry about the ones in red. The summary tab is the first tab you would fill out. Grant charges is the second tab. Match charges is the third tab. That 4th tab, this is your payment request, that DPR 364. This is what you'll fill out last. Let me see. So going back to that summary tab, which is what you'll fill out first, I want to point out that there are instructions directly on the form, and I'm kind of going to follow the flow and the instructions just so that you'll get comfortable referring to them here and there. They're not too difficult to use. Instruction 1, you want to enter your grantee name, your project title, performance period, project number. So there we have Cleveland National Forest, ground operations. This is their project number. All of that information is right there on their project agreement. I highlighted it in green. It has to agree with that project agreement. Number 2, enter your current payment request as appropriate. So in this case, we're going to say it's their very first payment request, 1. Number 3, payment request period. Enter the time period you are requesting payment for. It has to be within that performance period. So Forest Service generally reports on a quarterly basis. Here we have January through March. I want to say something quickly, and we'll probably hit on it later on. If for some reason you have a service provided at the very end of your performance period, say it something happened in December and you needed to hire a contractor to come and blow a boulder off your road, right? If it happened within the performance period, the last month, it still works, even if the invoice shows up after the performance period. If it shows up, say, for instance, January 2024, and then you weren't able to pay it until February 2024, that's okay. It's still within the 120 days that you have to submit your closeout. Do include it in your closeout and just make sure that the activity service period is highlighted on that invoice. That is what we are looking for sure. Let me see. The next instruction is number 4, right here. And it says, grant payment requests 1 through 6. Enter your prior approved payment requests as processed by OHMVR division. Here we have 1 through 6. So this is the first payment request that we'll say this grantee is working on. Nothing was approved, so nothing goes there yet. That is blank. Leave it blank. Number 5, it says current request will autofill from the grant charges second tab. Enter your current grant request in the grant charges second tab, and this is what you want to be reimbursed for the payment request period. This instruction is telling you to fill out what you want to be paid for here. And it'll populate right here in this line. For now, we're going to leave it blank because we're filling out what doesn't change. Number 6, grant allocation. Enter your project agreement cost estimate by cost category total. This total should equal your grant award. This is really important. It's an area that's missed regularly by grantees. So we're going to go back to our example right here. There we go. Let me see. Cost category total. What does that mean? I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of staff. Here it is, staff. Grant cost 48,536. I already entered it here. Next, we have contracts. 65,000. There we go. Material supplies, 1,500. Equipment use, 0. Equipment purchase, they have none as well. Others, they didn't budget anything in the other cost category. Indirect is populated, but I'm going to delete it for now to show you, you can already math check it against your project cost estimate. Total direct expenses, $115,036, and it agrees. Very good. Very good. That's the total for direct. Indirect right here. They have some in match, but they do have some in grant. Total for indirect cost, $3,500. There. There we go. We have the total project allocation, the grant award right here, $118,536. Let me see. That is great. You are done with that, populating your grant allocation for the performance period. The only thing that might change here is a reallocation, and that is if you want to include the reallocation that was approved here, but that's a different matter. Email your grant administrator if you want to do a line item or category transfers of funds if they're needed and supported by your project. So we could talk about it. Let me see. Had that entered before? So here we have, next on the instructions is 7. Like grant, the instructions say 1 through 6. Here's 1 through 6 payment request numbers. Enter your prior approved payment request match as approved by division. So again, this is the first one, so there's nothing to enter yet. Number 8, current match request will autofill from the match charges 3rd tab. Enter your current match report in the match charges 3rd tab for payment for the payment request period. So it's directing your attention to this tab. And that number, the totals will populate right here. You don't have to enter it, it's an autofill. We'll do that in a second to show you how that works. We're going to skip to number 9, minimum match required. This is a number that absolutely does not change. Enter the required match percent found on page 2 of your project agreement. So we're going to go back to the project agreement. Your project agreement is your program Bible. Always refer to it for what's allowable and what is not. That's your first, how do you say, route of attack? Your second, if you have questions, is the regulations and your grant administrator. That always refer to your project agreement. Your grant administrator at the state, us, we always do. For everything that you buy and the activities that you do, what you have on your project accomplishment report. Here we are, we're on page 2 of Cleveland North's project agreement. And right here it says 26% match. So I'm going to enter that right here, 26%. Enter. Does not change. Will always be the same. And down below, you will see here's the minimum required match calculations, and to the right is the indirect. This will give you a grant expenses to date. So when we start entering costs in that grant tab, they will show here as well as that top portion of this page. It'll record the match to date. It'll give you a total project cost, and it will let you know based on your matching grant expenses to date, it will give you a minimum required match. And it'll let you know for the reporting period if you need more match or if you are over in match. And being over matched is always a good thing. It's never a bad thing, especially if it's in cash. Right here, to the right, we have the indirect cost category. Once you start entering your numbers, it'll start working and it'll let you know what your maximum allowable indirect is to date. Both of these will be feeding on actual costs, not what you budgeted, what you've actually spent to date. For what you've spent to date, it will let you know what your maximum indirect allowable is. It's what you want. Right here, it says total indirect grant plus total indirect match. It'll let you know those total costs. And right here's what it'll tell you if you can add more indirect or if you already have too much indirect. The last thing that I want to talk about before I have Jess take over is if during the performance period, if you are red in match, meaning you don't have enough, and say you might be over an indirect, it's okay if it's during the performance period. What matters is that towards the end of the grant, that's when you really want to be like an eagle eye over it, and you want to make sure that you're on track to meet your minimum required match by the end of the performance period, and that by the end of the performance period, you've spent enough direct grant expenditures to justify what you're reporting in indirect costs. That's what's important. So towards the end of the performance period is when you really want to monitor it and make sure you're coming in line with both of these percents. That said, I am going to turn the baton over to Jess, and she's going to talk more about the grant tab.
Okay, there I am, my little bubble. So I'm just going to fill out the grant tab, just giving you some examples, and then we're actually going to go back over to the summary tab so you can see how everything is starting to load. And I'm typing, let's see if we get some movement. There we go. Okay, so just an example. Let's say we had $30,000 in labor, and then I add that total. Now I'm going to put my attachment number, which I'm labeling S1 to represent staff and the first attachment for the staff. And then I would say, you know, let's say forest time. You can get more detailed. You can break it up and show different positions if you'd like to. For contracts, I'm just going to put one total for each of these line items. And for contracts, let's say I'd go C1 for the first contract, and we would say bolt pumping, let's say. We see that a lot. Materials and supplies. Maybe I bought some PPE. I'm going to title that M1 and PPE. If you want to get more detailed with the notes and say what line item, that's a great time also to communicate with us, especially when you have a large submission with a lot of these rows filled out. Putting the line item and what it is in the notes is really helpful. Just kind of like a decoding system, a way of communicating with each other. And then during that first payment request, I spent some time pulling together everything and filling out the project accomplishment report, all my grant administrator roles, and grant admin time, let's say, we see pretty commonly. Okay, so pretty simple. If there's any other details, like Maria was talking about, if you missed an invoice from a first payment request, now it's the second payment request and you're adding it in here, this is another box where you can communicate with us and just let us know some variance. That's completely for you to type in information and communicate with us.
Thanks,
now I'm going to come back over here and look, magic. Look where Maria was talking about down below. We've got grant expenses to date, match to date. Well, we haven't filled out match yet, so it's 0. Total project cost to date, minimum match required. And guess what? I haven't filled anything out. So now it's telling me I have a deficit. It's that red that Maria was talking about. So I'm under on match, but that's okay because Maria's going to show us how to fill out match. And if you don't have match at this point, that's okay too, because the match is due at the end of a project. So it's okay to see red here and in indirect on payment requests 1 through 4. If that last payment request is going to show where you're catching up. We expect that to happen. One other thing I wanted to mention, the most common thing we don't see filled out is this row 34, those grant allocations. If you don't fill out those totals, which is your award amount, then it's, that's what's driving all of these under over totals and the totals down here. That's part of what works in conjunction to give you this readout. So always make sure, maybe make a special note there in your notes to fill out row 34 for the grant allocations like Maria showed. And I would say the second most common thing folks forget to populate is the match requirement. So if those two things aren't populated, aren't entered by you, then none of this information is going to generate correctly for you. I recently had that on a payment request. They forgot to put in their allocations, and by the time I processed it, they were way over on indirect. And they asked why that happened, and it was really just because the allocations row hadn't been filled out, so it wasn't working properly. Anything else you want to add before we go to match, Maria?
No, just that. Notice the current request for the grant right there. It shows what you just entered: the 30,000, 2,500, 750, 33,000 to 50. That's exactly what Jess just entered in the grant charges second tab. So you don't, you grantees don't have to worry about keying that twice. So
such a well-designed workbook, Maria. Thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you, Jess. Thank you for testing it. So here we are on the match charges third tab. So I'm going to go ahead and do similar to what Jess just did in the other one. You know what? I'm going to say that you had 3 really successful volunteer days. We'll say 3,000, 2,000, and another 2,000. And each of these had a different attachment number. Oops, that's 2, that's 3, that's 4. There's nothing matched for contracts. Materials and supplies, we'll say perhaps you had some donated. For anything donated, materials and supplies, you want to have some sort of a value or a quote document that shows similar type of supplies at similar quantities to justify the value that you're attributing to your match. I'll say that's MS2. And we'll say they were ground tools. Ground tools. Or fencing. So one of my forests one time had a really large chunk of fencing materials donated, and that was it's great to see. Nice to see the community be involved. So I'm going to click back on the summary tab. See what happens. Right here on the current request for match, that number populated. The total's 9,000, and I'll just click back here just to verify. I'll look down below. You can see this is where the totals are: 7,000, 2,000, 9,000. There, 7,000, 2,000, 9,000. And now you'll see right here, match to date, the numbers right there. The total project cost number updated. Now the minimum match, this is what it currently is with the grant expenses that just entered. But see, that red is lower. I'm getting closer to that, meeting that 11,682. So how much indirect you're allowed doesn't, it's kind of, that doesn't change too much because your indirect, how much you're allowed will always be based off your direct grant cost, what Jess just entered. Let me see. So it is, it did drop because I entered some, no, I left it blank. That's why it stayed the same. Thank you. Keep me on track here. There's no indirect match, so that's why the numbers stay the same.
And one other thing to add on the indirect, so, the indirect percentage, it's not that you just get a straight 15%. You can ask for 15% on your application, but let's say you didn't include any indirect at all on your project agreement. And after the fact, you thought, oh, shoot, I just learned in this class right now that that's allowed. Maybe it should be something I can talk about with my grant administrator. You would reach out to us by email and we would discuss, if you're able to add indirect. We do have kind of a grid where we can allow certain increases based on your total award, certain variants for the indirect. So you do want to make sure to reach out to us. So again, if you have no indirect at all, we would expect you would not submit that unless you emailed us and talked about it. If you only asked for 5% but realized, oh, you need 10%, then again, you're going to email you with your grant administrator and we can see what we're able to approve for you. So do get us involved on that.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, Jess. Moving grant funds into indirect might work like reallocation, for instance. That's one mechanism that we have.
Right, because you can't go over your total award amount, right? So whatever you're going to add to that bucket, you're taking from somewhere else. So do keep that in mind.
No.
Oh, you know what, Maria? We left everything populated, so I guess I'll just kind of click through it. Last night when we were practicing, I entered all this information, but really what we wanted to show you here in the demo is where to find the information for that payment request form. So if we scroll up to the top here, this is page 1, and at the bottom you see certificate of funding, right? Whenever I'm helping somebody fill out their workbook, my best practice is I just cut and paste right out of the project agreement. So because this is highlighted, it selects the whole thing, but if it wasn't highlighted, you would just click and drag, highlight it, right click, and you can copy. And the benefit of literally copying and pasting from your project agreement is that you're less likely to accidentally key in a number incorrectly. This information is really important because it is what tells Fiscal, the team that approves these payment requests, where that funding is coming from. And I would say it's a very common thing that folks forget to put in. If you forget to put this information in, and let's say you send it through DocuSign, it is a little tricky for us to be able to add it, right? Because it usually locks the document. So do please take a moment before you PDF this to get it signed and fill out information. There's other sections here that we'll review that you're going to fill out too. So the contract number, again, you can see that highlighted on the right. You would enter it here. Sometimes I find it easier just to click up into the formula bar to type in information and then hit return. If you have any problems entering, do try that, or you can try to enter it right into the Excel in the cell itself. So we've got the contract number, that's unique to you. The activity code, that's actually a funding code where your funds are coming from. And then the ENY is when that funding was approved, the year it was approved. The supplier ID, which again is also found here on your project agreement, all these data points, that is unique to you as well. So that's how we know in our system how we're paying you and where to send that check to. And then you check a box for reimbursement. If you're on an advanced system, you would check the advanced box. It is an entirely different workbook you'll be using though. And then if I scroll down here, you could look at this section here where it shows all the numbers that you entered. It just gives you a nice little snapshot of what's included in this payment request. You could check it one last time before you get your signature, make sure everything looks good. You've got your total grant amount that's feeding in from the grant allocations line. And Maria's going to show you what to do when you have subsequent payment requests. But let's say I'm on payment request number 3, this reimbursement to date is actually going to populate that number. And then it's going to show me what my current total is, what my current reimbursement is, and what the remaining funds will be after this one's processed, along with the total match. So it is another good place from a budget perspective to know where you're at with your payment requests, your funding, how much left you have to go. A lot of folks will manage these projects in their own Excel, and they spend a lot of time setting up formulas and making sure everything reads. But really, these workbooks that Maria enhanced are an excellent project management tool for your budget. You could add in line items as they come in and just keep populating it until it's time to pull the trigger and actually submit it and see where you're at with your project.
Hey, Jess and Maria.
Yeah.
Do I need to do a new workbook every year, or my numbers, they look awfully the same as last year's? Can I just use last year's workbook?
I think a lot of folks do, but the one thing you'd have to do is make sure that you updated all of this information based on the new project agreement. The only thing that's going to stay the same is going to be your supplier ID. So the supplier ID is basically like your address for where we're sending your warrant, basically. But the contract number is going to change, the activity is going to change, and the ENY is going to change. So that's a great question, Deb. We get that a lot, where folks want to be efficient, which is great because, you've got your name in there already. You've got maybe your project title and that didn't change. But the things that do change are your project number and all those financial coding numbers as well. So anything to add there, Maria?
Just everything that's in that light gray that you see, everything there fed in from the other pages. We keep nothing in before our meeting, except for I did forget to delete those so that Jess could enter them fresh, these codes that you get from your project agreement. But everything on this page, we didn't enter anything, none of it. It all fed from the other pages that we just filled out in front of you right now.
Which I love. It's like magic, Maria.
Yeah.
Maria fed all of these to make it so that you only really have to enter a lot of the information on that summary page, and then it echoes through to this form, which is awesome.
We're trying to reduce the keying for you. The other little piece right here where it says invoice bill for collection number, that's like for the United States Forest Service. If you want to refer to one of your specific bills of collection, you'd enter that there.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that because sometimes we'll forget to put that number in invoicing, but when you put it here, it is a good reminder. I know a lot of you are saving the activity reports with the number embedded into it, and that's really good within the label of that document. And then the send warrant is where you're putting your address. This should be the same address that we have on file for the forest. It's all the same address up in Portland. For the BLMs, it's the same address here in Sacramento. And then for everybody else, it's whatever you registered with us when setting up as an agency. And then at that point, you can PDF this page and send it off for signature. You notice that it's your authorized representative that should be signing this. And the way that we check for that is we look what was on your application. So whoever you have listed as your authorized representative on your application, this is the signature we'd expect. If there's any variations to that, let's say somebody moved on or retired, which we see, send an email to your grant administrator and say, hey, our authorized representative, they retired. We see that a lot with law enforcement. A lot of folks in higher positions, retire out. Now there's a new person. You just send us an email and say, this is who we designate now as our authorized representative. And then moving forward, that would be the signature that we would look for. You can PDF this and send it through DocuSign. If you do so, make sure that you actually set up a field for the date. Even though DocuSign has the date embedded into the signature, the fiscal team often will kick it back because they're always looking for a date here. So you want to make this the signature field and this a date field. And then don't forget, we have to sign it after you. So you're going to designate this as a signature field, and this is a date field for us as well. And then Maria, you were going to show how to do the PDF signature.
Yeah. So if you're not using DocuSign, that's okay. I'm going to go to this unsigned copy of a project agreement. It is a PDF. You can go up to this pin right here, click it. It already prompted me to for my choice of signature styles, but it'll allow you to enter your signature right there. See right there, there's my signature. I'm dragging it around. I could drop it in anywhere here. So I'll just escape out of that. We do accept that as well. I'm not sure how they do it, but I have also seen people digitally sign just the Excel form and submit it in Excel. These two different forms of submitting, they work as well. So you don't have to stick with just DocuSign.
And of course, the old school ink signature, right? Print it out, walk it over to whoever has to sign it, then you're scanning it. That's totally acceptable. The one thing that I sometimes see submitted that we can't accept is you just typing in your info. you know, so if somebody's typing in their actual name here, we don't consider that a signature, right? Anybody could type in somebody's name. So just make sure it is truly a signature and not just a, you know, typed in format there. All right, subsequent payment requests, Maria.
Okay.
What do we do? PR2.
Let me see. Let me get my mouse to reappear on the screen. Just a second. Where did it go?
Well, I know the first thing that you're going to do is save that document.
You sure are, Jess.
You know what? Let me stop control on my end, and that should give you automatically control back. Does that work? Perfect.
I got the mouse back now. All right. So let me see. We're going to go to the summary request. I'm going to shrink this because we completed entering our project information from our project agreement. Now the project agreement only needs to be referenced to verify that the costs that you're charging to the project are eligible and support your project deliverables. Like Jess just said, the first thing that we're going to make sure is that this workbook in its entirety, the way it was processed for payment request number 1, was saved. It's saved, it was preserved. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a save as, and we're probably going to name it G220202G01 PR2. Now we're going to start doing PR2. I'm going to do that save. Okay, so the second thing that we are going to do, and this is really important, PR1, we'll say PR1 was already processed and it was approved. It was good to go. You submitted PR1 with the required project accomplishment report. Everything checked out fine. You actually didn't hear from your grantee, from your grant administrator until you got paid. They just let you know you got paid. That means, hey, everything was great. So here I am. Now I'm going to enter 30,000 up here. That's from this line right here. 2,000, 5,000, 500, 750. There we go. Totals agree. That is instruction number 4. 1 through 6. Enter your prior approved payment request as processed by OHMDR division. I'm going to do the same for match. 7,000. Oops. 2,000. There we go. $9,000. Now I'm going to go to the grant charges tab. That was also yesterday. It happened already. I'm done with that. I'm not going to duplicate anything I reported previously. I'm going to do the same for the match. That's all deleted. All right. Now you'll see the current request is blank for both grant and match. I'm going to go back to grant. A whole new report. A new payment request period. We'll say this 4/1-2023, following March, May, June, July. We'll say this through July. Hopefully I got the days of the month correct, right? I'm not sure if it's 30 or 31. There we go. See that information refreshed up here? Now it's the new payment request period. Now I'm going to say, well, for this performance period, I got $1,500 in match. Low production performance period. Maybe it was winter and storming, so you couldn't do much. That happens. Let me see. But you did get some contract costs. I'll say that's $500. One. And for match, you did have one volunteer day, and it was great. Fun. That was it. And you paid a portion of a contract in match. You matched it with your match cash dollars. So we'll say it was covered by some sort of federal money. Say it was covered by $500 Fed money. So it was a match to our program. That's the one. Okay. So right there, 1,500. Here's your total, 1,500 for match. Go right here. There it is, match, 1,500, 1,500 for match. We'll go back to what we entered for grant. We entered 1,500 for staff, 500 for contracts. Total is $2,000 right here. There's your current grant request, 1,500, 500, $2,000. Down below, oh, I have more matching in my program. My red is less than it was before, but you'll see that the grant expenses to date continue to update, the match expenses to date continue to update, so do the project costs. So this is a year-to-date tracking. Each time you do a save as and you update it for new payment requests. The indirect costs, they updated as well. Let me see.
I have one thing to add there, Maria.
Sure.
One thing that I sometimes see, or we sometimes see on subsequent payment requests, is the wrong total listed under payment request 1 or past payment requests. So make sure that if we make any adjustments during our review, and we'll always send you back that workbook, make sure that's the copy that you're going off of and that you're updating what you have in the folder, because we will check. This is the first place when we do a subsequent payment request, we go check to make sure that those totals from the past payment requests align with what we have on the last workbook.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jess. We do. It's like it's a living file. It's one to the next, but they all tie together. It should be a melody, and you'll see these populate depending on the amount of payment requests that you submit and get approved. If for some reason you have more than 6 payment requests that you're submitting to the department, to us, just let us know. Your grant administrator will modify the workbook to add more lines for you. We'd be glad to do that. We just want to preserve the integrity of the total lines. Let me see, Jess, did I miss anything?
No, that's great. I think this is probably the most intimidating part of the workbook. Just kind of, there's a lot of information there, but I really like when Maria added the instructions on the right-hand side. She did that as an additional pass after developing these further. So if you ever forget what to fill out, always fall back on those yellow instructions and the blue arrows on the right, and it will help guide you through it. And then, of course, hopefully we'll have this video available, but, it might take a minute to zoom up to this part. So just, you know that you have some instructions there on the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you do. And your grant administrator is always glad to help you as well. I'm just going to do one more click on the DPR 364 tab so that you could see how the numbers updated for the new numbers. Right here, you have the new number for grant. You have the new number for match. The reimbursement to date, now it's counting what you submitted previously. The current amount available updated, taking into account what you already paid out from your grant. So it's a running balance. The remaining grant funds is right there. And then it's also adding what you reported match to date. This was the current report, but it's also adding what you reported previously, that 10,500, and we'll look at the summary tab and you'll see there's the total, 10,500.
And then it also shows your over/under balances too, right, on that summary tab, which is nice. So you can see where you're at with your category totals, how much staff you have left.
Yeah, it sure does. So use this workbook. It's meant to inform you of where you are in your grant expenses at all times and your match at all times. And do let us know if you have any questions. Actually, now's probably a good time to pause and see if we do have any questions.
You can raise your hand or throw something in the chat. All right, let's talk about the PAR, the Project Accomplishment Report.
Back to you, Matt.
So you hear the word PAR, that's the Project Accomplishment Report. We've talked about it, now we can see what it looks like. We call this the tell your story of what you did with your grant and match funds form. You know, I will say when I do a payment request review, it's one of the first things I pull up. I pull up the PAR, I look through it, I look at the date range, I check to see if that activity period at the top matches what's on that payment request. And then I start to get to know what you all did, what you accomplished. This is obviously from Mendocino National Forest. They have two different divisions that they, or districts, I should say, that they report on. And so they do separate their PARs into districts. So they have the one district read out on what they did and the other district. And so I look at both of the PARs and I see what everybody's been up to. Here's Grindstone Ranger District, GRD. Looks like they were at the OHV campgrounds, which is about 10 acres of land, and they were doing all of their, you know, cleaning out the fire rings and collecting fees and everything. I'm looking on the right under that work accomplished or work completed. I'm looking for deliverables that line up with what I see on the project agreement. And I'm also looking for an OHV nexus. I'm seeing how what was accomplished relates to OHV. Sometimes on our law enforcement PARs, which will look a little different, but quite similar to this, you'll see, you know, they went out and found somebody that was cutting down Christmas trees illegally. They'll report on this. And so if I'm looking at it and that's literally all that's read out, I say to myself, where's the OHV nexus? What does Christmas trees have to do with our OHV program, right? So often I'll email them and say, hey, you know what, can you tell me more about this? And they'll say, oh, well, we were out doing OHV patrol and we happened to come across somebody cutting down a Christmas tree. Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you don't necessarily have to read out on the Christmas tree cutting. It does, you know, can add a little confusion. But if you did want to put that on your project accomplishment report, say that you were out doing OHV patrol and this is what you found. You know, make sure that there's always that OHV nexus to show that these funds are going to OHV related activities, which is really important. If a member of the public is going to challenge a project and say, hey, I don't think anybody's out patrolling this area, you know, for a law enforcement example, which has happened. Actually, I did receive a call from the public in the past, and they said, hey, I don't think they're out there patrolling. The first place I went was their PAR. So I pulled up the PAR and I looked and I found the area. I think it was actually a trail number that was listed, which was helpful. And I could report that, you know, 80 hours of patrol occurred. So they actually are out there. Maybe that person had missed them, but you know, it's not just for the grant administrator to know what's going on, but it's any member of the public has access to any of these documents. If they wanted to request anything, they're able to do so. There's a formal process to do so, but you know, you want to make sure that you're telling the story so that all the sets of eyes that look at this after us understand what you accomplished and see the value in the funds that you're spending within this program. For the acres and routes, list whatever's easiest for you. You know, the trail numbers are helpful. If you want to list acres, that's kind of representing an area. With that law enforcement example, sometimes there'll be illegal incursions. The LEs are out trying to monitor, and maybe they sat on 5 acres of land watching for these incursions. In that scenario, listing acres makes a lot of sense. But a lot of times with ground ops or we're actually doing work out on the trail, it makes more sense to list miles. So that's an either or. You can list either acres or miles, but what is required on all the PARs is hours worked. And those hours worked should align with what we see on those labor reports. And next slide, please.
Thanks, Jess. So this is the lower half of that project accomplishment report, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Just follow the order and respond to all of the questions. Number 2, list the deliverables of that were accomplished beyond what was listed in that number 1 that Jess just showed you. And then, are you currently trending to spend all your grant funds and meeting your match requirement? If indirect costs were included, here, number 5 is where you put the explanation of what it was used for, that indirect match. Did you purchase equipment? Yes, no. And then it asks you, did you submit those photos? Then number 7 is where it asks that question actually about the photos. Number 8 is for your final payment request only, and it's frequently left blank actually. It asks if there was money, if there's grant funds unspent, money left on the table. Why? Provide an explanation. And like I said, it's frequently left blank. You want to address it. We actually cannot close your grant without that question being responded. And it doesn't have to be complicated or verbose, just a simple explanation. If you weren't able to accomplish a project deliverable, please note that, what project deliverable you weren't able to accomplish. But maybe it was just because you came in under budget, you know what I mean? It is a project cost estimate, costs do fluctuate. Also, it might be that you actually did accomplish all of your project deliverables, but you just didn't do them to the level that you wanted to. You know what I mean? You had to scale back a little bit. So that happens too, and that's we understand if situations arose for you. Just like I said, that communication with your grant administrator is pretty important. Let me see. Next slide, please. Right here, particularly for ground operations and restoration, we like the attachments, the photo attachments that show the before and after pictures with GPS coordinates and an indicator of, you know, the trail name. What happened? They tell the story of what you did before and after. If it's not clear from the photos what you did from your before and after pictures, we love descriptive captions too. So this is a pretty good example shown. Next slide, please. Are there any questions so far? I'll pause here for questions.
We got a request to see an example of a law enforcement PAR, and I just popped that example in the chat.
Nice.
In addition to that, BLM Ukiah, I will say they do some really detailed PARs, which is appreciated. They also put with their, well, actually all of their PARs, even more detail of the trail and the length of the trail, which is not required, but boy, would that ever hold up to an audit if somebody questioned it. So there's an example for you. Does anyone else have any questions?
Hey, Jess, I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so I have a question.
Yeah.
Why is it the PAR so important for us? I mean, in regards to the division, I know we provided that, we asked for this information. Why is it that we asked for it?
Well, for me, gives me an idea of the project. You know, it's until you get to go out on a site visit, you're a little, you know, you're not familiar exactly with the ongoing. So that's definitely one of the first places to get to know a project. For me, it's always where I start with the payment request. Maria, you were going to add something?
Oh, no, just it tells the story of what you did. Everything that you bought, you will provide the narrative of the project deliverable that you were working towards accomplishing. So it's really, God, it just ties everything together. And between the workbook expenditure report and the project agreement, the project accomplishment report, that's what tells the story about how you're moving forward with your grant project. And also it's, I guess it's accountability. We never know when we'll get the public calling in with questions or what have you. So it shows your good work. I think you should be proud of your good work.
Absolutely. It's probably my favorite part of a payment request. I don't know about you, Maria, but specifically seeing the before and after pictures. And I'll save them. You know, like I saved that law enforcement one. I have a document folder of good examples just in case people ask. And, you know, I'll save some of these gold standard examples to share with people because it is nice to see, you know, what do we consider a really good job. Sometimes the law enforcement PARs come in kind of lean. You know, there's not a lot of information listed on the right-hand side of what was accomplished. So, you know, listing what type of contacts that you made and, you know, what you actually did is a lot more meaningful than just, you know, sometimes you'll see something like 5 citations were issued, but it doesn't really tell you much. What were those citations? What are you guys seeing? You know, if any of our law enforcement rangers, when they're reading your applications, if they want to learn about your program, sometimes they'll reach out and say, hey, you know, what kind of issues do you see that's happening in BLM Ukiah? Well, I can pull that up and give a really detailed explanation of what they're seeing. You know, no helmets. I know they have issues with people that are staying longer than the BLM allows them to on their land and that type of thing.
Very good point, Jess. And I just add to that, it lets us know as a division and as just the public as the OHV program as a whole for that agency. So it kind of gives us an idea of a good sum up of what's going on for their program. So if anyone does call and ask, we can say, hey, this is what's going on. And it's exactly what you guys pointed out. It keeps accountability.
Yeah, because boy, do people that are passionate about OHV sometimes challenge this program, and we always have to keep that in mind. This is OHV's funds coming in and staying within the OHV, you know, the program, these projects, and there's a lot of people that are passionate about that, including us. So, all right, let's talk about emailing it. So we've talked about, you know, timelines, organization, supporting documents. We went over the workbook. We talked about the PAR. Now you have everything you need, let's say, for your first payment request submission. What do you do with it? What you're going to do is email it to us. In the past, you would send it to your grant administrator, but now we have this lovely compliance team that helps us out, and they field the ohv.grants@parks.ca.gov inbox. And maybe Deb can type that in the chat for everybody, that email address, if I went too fast with it. But what the compliance team does with these emails is they actually have a payment request log. So they check it in and say, hey, this is the date we received it. And that way, if leadership ever wanted to follow up and say, hey, Jess, what's taking you so long with this, you know, this payment request? It seems like we, you know, received it a while ago. That's just one checkpoint to make sure that we're moving things forward as soon as we can. Not only that, but they will file it for us. They actually file it in a digital folder, which makes it really easy for us. It's ready to go. We can jump in when we have time. I noticed that I have 3 waiting for me right now, you know, based on us working on these payment requests and whatnot. But the fact they're sitting there ready for me to go, I can jump into those folders and start working through them quickly. So I definitely appreciate that compliance is helping with this. You also want to CC your grant administrator. That gives us a heads up that it's coming. It helps us because sometimes it will take maybe 24 hours to 48 hours for compliance to file a payment request submission. But if I see a bunch flying in, kind of puts a fire under anything I'm working on, because I go, woof, I got emailed 3 of them yesterday, and I'm like, I better hurry up with this PowerPoint, you know, and try to get over to those payment requests. In that email, you know, let's say it's a smaller submission, you're just popping in maybe a PDF of all the scanned documents all together, you know, in order of the workbook categories. You put an Excel copy of the workbook, an Excel copy of the PAR, which is really important because if we need to make an adjustment like we've been talking about, where we have to disallow something, or maybe you forgot to put in your grant allocation row, we really appreciate having a copy of the Excel version of the workbook. We don't need a copy of the PDF version, just the Excel is great. And then and we talked about the larger submissions, you're likely going to zip your folder together and email it. And recently I saw one of our grantees had to send 3 emails with zip folders because it was a good amount of documentation. That can be based on the limitation of their server or our server receiving it, and that's fine too. We talked about labeling in the subject line, you know, the product number, agency, payment request, 1A, B, C, you know, just kind of indicating those different emails are connected to the same payment request. So that's a really good thing to do. And I think we were going to take a break here, but we have some information we want to cover, and I say we keep going unless anybody else disagrees with that.
We're actually almost done.
We are almost done, but we have 20 minutes left, and I think the next slide is a good one.
I say power through. You're
Power
almost on the
through.
home stretch.
Maybe we just do one of Deb's stretches. She's always really good at the workshop to remind everybody to twist a little, get the fluids moving in the brain, take a sip of the water.
Jump up and down, do some burpees.
Yeah. We used to do those in the office when we all worked together.
I can bang out 30.
Oh.
Maria's over in the break room doing pull-ups.
Challenge thrown down, Maria.
All right, let's keep going because the next slide's a really good one and we want to leave some room for questions and we are coming towards the end of time here. So we'll go next slide, please, Matt. Okay, so common payment request issues. This is a list we compiled. We reached out to grant administrators and said, hey, are we missing anything? We got some feedback. But these are common reasons why we'll send a submission back to you. And usually that's in the form of email with notes in it. If a receipt's hard to read, even if you kind of sort of can see what you're looking at, you might want to rescan it because maybe the next person can't, maybe an auditor can't interpret what's on there. So just be kind of particular with that. Maybe when you scan it, you change the resolution or the contrast. Go back one slide, Matt. Mismatched totals on an activity report versus what's on a receipt. Maria talked about that. She added notes on a line item because part of the line item was indirect. That's something that you can do. You can handwrite, you can type, do whatever you want. Put information on there that makes it clear, what you're claiming on that workbook. Maybe the purchases were higher than what was approved. I recently saw a payment request come through where, 30 gloves were purchased. And in looking at the payment request, there were only 6 gloves approved. So I asked, what happened? What's going on? And I'm waiting to hear back on that. An item description on an invoice or receipt's missing or it's not clear. That's where you might want to add a note. A lot of times we're still going to go check that item on the website to make sure that what you purchased is what you're stating, but putting a little tip there, pointing us in the right direction is helpful, and we can also understand how it might have been used. Items purchased late in the performance period, that's going to trigger us to ask, was it even used? If you ordered a bunch of helmets, let's say for a law enforcement project in November, did you get them in time to actually use them on patrol? The intent of a project agreement is that you're purchasing items that you're using throughout that performance period. So those of you in charge of purchasing, get those materials and supplies ordered as soon as you can because, we expect that you're actually going to be using those on the project during that performance period. And if you don't, we're going to ask you why. And if you want to be proactive and let us know what's going on, that's fine too. I had an agency tell me recently they needed to get more PPE for the cold weather that started rolling in at the end of the year. So they made some purchases at the end of the year, but they were proactive, sent me an email. I saved that in the folder and we were good to go. We need pictures of equipment, like Maria said, with the OHV Funds at Work sticker displayed. A lot of times we won't receive that. We need it by the closeout in order to close out that project. So sometimes there can be delays, but do make sure that's included. Another thing that compliance looks for too, along with us, is charges that show up on an activity report after the fact. Those combined spending and payroll details, we understand there's a delay, and sometimes those charges will hit in January or February for a project that ends in December. That's okay as long as we have an invoice that shows the order was placed and received within that performance period. Sometimes we'll also look at the pay period for the forest, or I guess I should say often we look at the pay periods of the forest to make sure that, does that pay period fall within that performance period. So the way you can help us is, be proactive about all of these things and communicate with us if there's any variances. It can delay a review when we hit some of these bumps in the road. Next slide, please.
Hey, Jess and Maria, we have a question. Can we go back to slide 28, please?
Okay.
So there's a question that says on screen page 28, is the PDF PR1 same as the Excel version?
It would be. It would be the Excel version of the payment request is what you turn into a PDF and sign and submit to us. So there's only one payment request version. You just convert it into an Adobe PDF document for signature.
And on that submission, they probably, and I made that myself. That's just a screenshot I put together and made it. But, you know, if I was a grantee and I just had one PDF, I probably have the payment request form signed in there and all the supporting documents all within that one PDF, which is fine for a smaller submission. You know, sometimes you'll literally get a payment request that's $1,200. Well, that's not a lot of documents. So you can scan those all together. Ultimately, we may separate them on our end.
Yeah.
But do make sure to put in the Excels, because sometimes we'll see like a PDF version of the workbook and we don't have the Excel. And then we're kind of stuck if we need to make a modification. Then we email you, hey, can I have a copy of that? We have to wait a little while, go work on something else. So I think that's a big thing, is making sure the Excels are in there. Do we still need to PDF it? Sorry, Deb, were you reading that?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I believe we finished answering her question. She says, sounds good, thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Good question, though.
I always find with the forest, when you guys are sending if you send the forest calendar in, your pay period calendar, that's always helpful. So we don't have to go look for that pay period calendar. It just makes a quick, easy reference if you guys have included it, even if it's just like with your first one. You know, as long as we have it in there somewhere, it's always nice to have.
For sure. I think we all have that saved as a favorite on our Explorer to pull it up. But gosh, if you send it in and even highlighted the pay periods within that, that would be gold standard. All right, next slide. I think we're 2 slides ahead, actually. There we are, unique situations.
Unique situations. Okay, so an invoice was not received when composing the prior payment request. This is okay. I believe, I think both Jess and I may have hit on this point earlier. If you, for a service, for instance, if they've already reported in Q1 and an invoice comes in that actually belonged in that quarter, but it just came in after the fact, it was delayed, it was processed late, and now you have it, it came in during the time for your Q2 processing. That's okay, just included with that second payment request period, reporting period. Just write a note next to it that it was omitted from the prior bill. That's not a problem. You have note sections. You have a section for notes on the summary tab and for the match tab and for the grant tab. This is your workbook. Feel free to utilize those notes, and then you could also enter comments and text boxes to explain. You could also mark things in different colors also. So not a problem. It is okay to submit with that next payment request, as the slide indicates. Let me see. Another unique situation that comes up. There's a delay in receiving equipment purchases and materials and supplies purchases. I believe we also hit on that in prior slides. Communicate with your grant administrator. What counts here? This is what we're looking for. You need to have started the purchase process earlier on in the performance period. The only thing that'll get you in trouble is you say your grant ends in December and then you started your purchasing process in October and November. Well, that's pretty late. But if you can demonstrate that you initiated the purchasing process in February, that's pretty early, but due to circumstances outside of your control, there could be shipping delays. What do you call it? Back order. The manufacturer has certain items on back order. That's outside of your control. If you just give us that email documentation that shows when you took the initiative, and something else that shows that it was due to circumstances outside of your control, that you got the piece of equipment late, because of good record keeping and good communication. If it was something outside of your control, you'll most likely still get a buy-in from division. It'll still be okay. Let me see. Source of match falls through. So this happens periodically. Ideally, we want grantees to budget realistic match goals with plans already in line, say for volunteers days or what have you. If due to circumstances outside of your control, I mean, it happened with COVID, right? All of a sudden we couldn't be in the same space together anymore. So there go the volunteer days, the group volunteer days. Yeah, just email your grant administrator. Let us know what happened. If you can get a different source of match that still supports your project deliverables, it'll most likely work. There is flexibility, particularly in the match category. If all of a sudden you get a large donation that supports your project deliverables, I mentioned one of my forest agencies got a large donation of fencing. It will most likely work. Again, just diligent communication with your grant administrator and that email documentation for your project file that shows that, hey, we said it was good to go. That's what matters here. So, yeah, are there any other questions here? Yeah, we don't mind.
We save a lot of emails, don't we, Maria and Deb? We say any type of communication on like changes to match, delays, and all that type of thing. We save a copy of that, but do make sure you're saving a copy of it too. That's something that an auditor is going to look for if there's any variances. They're going to look for our approval. They're going to look for proactive communication.
Yeah. So with that said, next slide. I believe Jess is going to take it on. We're at the home stretch here.
Final payment requests. This is our world right now. We've received lots of final payment requests, advanced closeouts. Again, that's due within 120 days of the project end date. So you look at your project agreement, that last date in that performance period, add 120 days, and that's when it's due. If you don't send it to us within that time frame, that could put you on the not in good standing list and impact your future application scores. So definitely something to try to stay on top of. And at this point, you know, that final submission, that final payment request or closeout, you should have all of your required match based on what's on your project agreement percentage that Maria showed. All your project deliverables should be completed. And if not, you should communicate with us. And there should also be funds left on the table for those deliverables. For ground ops and restoration projects, we need to know the total number of miles maintained or restored, and you want to enter that information on your final project agreement, project accomplishment report. And then if there's any reports or monitoring that's listed on that project agreement, we should have a copy of that for the file. We actually do save those reports and look them over. So does our environmental team if it relates to their environmental reviews. And then for ground disturbing projects with ground disturbing activities, that's where you're sending in your soils compliance report and your habitat management plan. One thing I'll say about that, if you want to send in your soils and your HMP before you round up all of your payment request documents, that is okay. A lot of folks will finish those documents in December. Send them to us right away. We have sometimes up to a month for soils to get approved, depending on how many Ryan is looking at, especially when we're close to this closeout window. He might receive 30 at the same time that he has to review. So get those in as soon as possible. Same thing for the HMP. We have to send those off to our environmental specialist to approve, and we can't process your payment request. Even if we finish our entire review of all your documentation, we can't approve that final payment request or close the project out until those are approved. So good strategy on getting paid quickly. That is it. We can field questions now. We can go to the next slide, our questions slide. And we have 5 minutes if anybody has any questions they want to ask.
Maria, do you want to address the document that was just shared in the chat?
Thanks. Debbie gave me a hand and she dropped the document that I mentioned earlier in the chat. It's a handout that lists out what you're allowed and not allowed in terms of equipment use for both regular equipment and heavy equipment. both for transportation and operation and also for maintenance. I for some reason, I'm not able to drop items into the chat myself. So Debbie did that for us. Please feel to download.
Looks like someone said they don't have access to clicking it. So Adam, when you click it, it's not allowing you to open it. Is that what you're seeing on your side?
It's telling me I need to request access.
Huh.
Oh, interesting.
Do you
I can
see a request for access, Deb? And
I will work on that, and if not, we can send these documents out. We can email everything out that we've talked about afterwards too.
Okay, got it. So nobody's getting access. Okay, guys.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Debbie actually has a copy of all the years. There's one for 18 through 19. There's one for 21, and then there's 22 to 23 that she tried to share. So she can send all of those because I know some folks are working on closeouts for those older projects too. All right, let's look at the last slide there. Feel free to keep asking questions, but we did want you aware of future classes that are coming too. You mentioned adding the pay period calendar for Forest Service. Does that break down person needs to be done, pay period, or break down the person? The Forest Service calendar we're talking about literally shows, you know, on the forest combined spending and payroll detail, it says PP and there's a number, the pay period. So what we're talking about, and I'm not sure if this answers your question, but we look at that activity report and then we compare it against what we see on the federal payroll schedules to see if there is a situation where maybe billing started before the performance period or it occurred after the performance period, which we would have to disallow. So that looks like this here, payroll schedule. And so the PP performance period would be like PP1, PP2, PP3. And so we go in and look to see if there's a chance where, you know, like payment period 1 is at the end of December. And so we would go, well, did that roll over to January, or is it possible that there were dates in here that they were trying to report on? And if there's confusion, we're usually going to reach out to you and say, hey, it looks like payment request, payment period 1 rolls over to January. Can you send me something that shows work was performed in this week so I can make sure that it falls within your performance period? This is what we use. What Deb is saying is, hey, if you want to submit it with your payment request, then it's just there in the folder with it, maybe following your or leading your report. And then anybody that would look at that documentation could see, you know, here's the 2022 payroll schedule. I know there's a few places that they have them listed online for the different years, you know, and this is something that we commonly will pull up. I know compliance very much so does as well. And if they have questions, they'll ask us, or, you know, same thing with our supervisor. So that's what we're talking there. Did that answer your question, or is it an internal document, but it shows what we look for when the requests come in?
That's a different topic.
Different topic. I know the forest and the BLMs, well, specifically the forest, they get emailed their combined spending and payroll detail quarterly. And if you're not receiving that, you do need to talk to the team that sends them out to make sure that you're listed as a contact. Maria, do you have anything to add on those topics that came in?
No. I will take a minute to address one of the questions that had come in was, what if the forest bill doesn't agree with what you want to be reimbursed for? Say the forest bill doesn't include an adjustment that you made. You can always cross out the forest bill, that amount, and write in the correct amount. And then on your combined mixed spending report, you can line out what doesn't belong in there. Jess talked about it earlier, so did I. Make your manual notes. For us, we would pay you regardless of whether or not you included the forest bill or not. But it is important to your system. Include your forest bill, but also contact your accounting person and let them know that cost didn't come in and the payment is actually going to be shorter than what is shown on the forest bill, because otherwise it'll generate a bill of collections.
All right, so it looks like we're out of time. That doesn't mean we can't answer questions in the future. So definitely give us an email and we will, follow up with any questions we weren't able to cover here. And I think Deb was just going to quickly talk about the upcoming class schedule.
Yeah, thank you, Maria and Jessica, for all of this great information on payment requests. I just wanted to quickly talk about that in April, we have the H&P workshop, that's April 26th. We have the soil compliance on April 27th. Those two are live. Then we have some pre-records that are coming up. Those will be posted in June. Those will be how to fill out PARs, the payment accomplishment reports. Then we'll be back live in August for the project agreement process. Then 2 in November, which we're talking about the payment request advance for BLMs and specifically for the nonprofits on the 16th. But we just wanted to say thanks again, everybody, for coming. We hope you had a great time and learned a bunch of information. If you need some assistance on what we went over today or any of these upcoming topics, go ahead and reach out to your grant administrator and we will email you out those documents that we talked about here. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining
Thanks, everybody.
us.
Everybody. Great job, team. Great job.
I appreciate your time.